My Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video I want to talk about a selection from the volume Morgoth's Ring, which is volume 10, I think, of the History of Middle-earth series, and it's the section called the Athrabeth Finrod a Andreth, and the English of that is the debate between Finrod and Andreth. Andreth is a mortal woman. Finrod, you should probably already know, is the elf lord in the Silmarillion stories who ends up helping Beren in his quest to regain the Silmaril. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you can check out my Silmarillion synopsis series on all of that. But you can get all of that out of your head because that's really kind of unimportant for the purpose of the discussion of this particular selection, because this selection is really not about any of the Silmarillion narratives at all. It's actually a conversation between Finrod and Andreth, this mortal woman, on basically the topic of theology. This is really the closest Tolkien ever came to getting explicitly Christian in any of his fiction. And so it's really interesting to explore because he's trying to use this conversation between these two different people as a way of introducing philosophical and theological concepts into Middle-earth that point towards Christianity, but then don't really totally go all the way. And it's a combination of introducing, combining our world with Middle-earth, because that's kind of always what he was trying to do, but also just a philosophical working through of some of the nature of his own view on Christian theology. And so it's really interesting. It's also kind of hard to follow because of the conversational format of what we're getting. It's not just a discourse or a lecture. It's these two people trying to figure out their own ideas in contrast to each other. But it's really interesting. And ultimately, Tolkien never published it, and it seems like he might have thought better of even doing the whole thing at all on the idea that it's a little bit too on the nose, a little bit too much. This is going too far in the direction of just basically putting Christianity in Middle-earth. But nevertheless, it's a really interesting piece of writing, and Christopher Tolkien, of course, very luckily gave it to us in the History of Middle-earth series. So let's take a look at what this piece of writing is like. So the basic frame of this conversation is that Finrod is visiting Andreth because one of the other men related to Andreth has died, and Finrod is coming to pay his respects. And they're having this conversation about death. And it comes out in the conversation that Andreth doesn't believe that humans were always mortal. At first, Finrod thinks that what she means is that they were much longer lived, not that they were immortal in the way that elves are, and she clarifies, no, I think we were actually immortal. Finrod thinks this is a little bit weird because as far as he knows, and based on what he knows from the Valar, and not much of that anyway, is the idea that men, unlike elves, are not destined for this world, but are destined to leave it. And so he thinks that it would be unnatural for their bodies, which would have to be coextensive at best with the world of Arda, which will end, to be that perfectly joined with their spirit, which is going to eventually be outside of Arda. And Andreth says that the traditions of men that she knows of actually says that even their bodies would outlive Arda. And Finrod thinks this is really weird, but begins to speculate maybe this has something to do with, what will eventually be the perfection of Arda when all the bad things that Melkor or Morgoth introduced into the music of the Ainur are corrected for, at the end of everything. Going along with the idea of death coming to men that wasn't really meant to be, Finrod speculates that perhaps this was just part of the general outcome of the marring of Arda, which is Melkor introducing all these bad things into the music. And Andreth says, no, our traditions say that it was kind of a special malice that Melkor had toward our people, and something that he did specifically to us, not just something that happened naturally. And you can see where her argument makes sense, because if it was just part of the general marring of Arda, why wouldn't it have affected elves? But Finrod, with this introduction of this idea into the conversation, thinks, is Melkor really that powerful? If he's that powerful, then he's more powerful even than we know, and we like used to live with this guy. And so there's a lot of that going on, and Finrod has a hard time believing that Melkor could do something to the children of Eru, elves men, that was not already part of their nature, because that would seem to implicate the idea that it would seem to imply that Morgoth can undo the purposes of Iluvatar, and that's just unthinkable to him. And the way that he kind of ends up resolving this in his own mind is that men must have done something that led to this. It can't just be that Morgoth just did it to you. It has to be something else. And the idea that men are masters of their own fate in ways that elves aren't, because if you read enough of Tolkien, you start to realize that, especially in the Silmarillion and related earlier drafts, men are not in the way that elves are as subject to the music of the Ainur. It's like they're kind of their own thing. The elves are kind of trapped by fate in ways that men are not. And so Finrod is taking this idea and thinking, well, maybe it's because you're so powerful with respect to your own ability to shape your own future that you in some way did this to yourself. And he's not denying the influence of Morgoth. And so what you can see here is that, in the Silmarillion, Tolkien hints at the idea of a fall of humanity in their distant past that they don't want to talk about. But here, Finrod is actually working out how philosophically that works, because he's like, well, Morgoth can't just do it to you, but maybe you did it to yourselves because of what he did. And this idea you can see shaping up is the idea that man indeed causes his own fall, but due to the influence of the Satan character, very much as in the Genesis story of, the Adam and Eve eating the apple because Satan tricks them into doing it. And so there's this, you could see very clearly where Tolkien is going here. And then he continues on along the same lines, and he's working out these ideas, but that's kind of where that goes. After this, the topic turns rather to the idea of what hope men have. And it turns out Andreth is a bit of a pessimist, and she's not too optimistic about the idea of what happens to men after death. And the men who are friends with elves are obviously much more in the realm of optimists than, say, other men would be, because they have the knowledge that they get from the elves that they have some hope beyond this life. But even she is, kind of almost despairing, it would seem. And it comes out, too, that there's some personal element for her in this, because she apparently ended up falling in love with an elf, specifically Ignor, who is Finrod's brother. And or was it Angrod? I can't remember which one of the brothers now. But anyway, they never ended up getting married, and Finrod basically says, he kind of avoided doing that for you. It's not because he didn't love you, it's because he did love you, and he didn't want to marry you and then you get old and die, and there he still is in the flower of his youth, basically. But all of this personal stuff comes up kind of as a side note, but the main thing is she also goes into this idea of men have this idea of the old hope, which is another tradition that goes way back. And that's another interesting thing about this I should mention, is a lot of what she talks about is some of the things she won't talk about, and those that she does are often very old ideas that have been inherited by men from way back. But this one particular idea of the old hope is the idea that Eru or Iluvatar himself will heal Arda or Ea as a whole. And Finrod even begins to speculate, how could he do that? And this idea of Eru entering into Arda itself comes into play. And this is where it really gets explicitly Christian, because here all is but saying is the idea of the incarnation, that, you know, God incarnate comes into the world and dies for our sins in the form of Jesus Christ. It doesn't go that far, obviously, because Finrod is merely speculating about something which is, from the point of view of Middle-earth in the Silmarillion, far, far into the future. But it practically comes out and says it because of the way he's speculating about how, you know, how could he, you know, fix it without doing this, and he starts to go into all these thoughts about how this could work. How could he come into the universe that he created, because isn't he bigger than the universe? It goes into all this philosophical stuff, and there's just so much here. I mean, I can't really get into all the details because it's just, like I said, it's complicated and hard to follow just because of the conversational style. But it's just a really fascinating read. But that's more or less where the thing ends up. Other than we see that Andreth, like I mentioned, is even at the end of the conversation is still not too optimistic about anything. Finrod, on the other hand, seems to have gone on this, you know, like philosophical mind train of thinking about the possibilities of all the things that have been raised as possibilities by Andreth because of the long traditions of men that have been handed down that she doesn't always buy into and sometimes does, and it's complicated. It's not always clear what Andreth actually believes even. But this is really the kind of seminal point in the discussion is when they reach this stage, because at that point, like I said, Tolkien is all but saying, you know, we're going to have God incarnate in the world. And this is partially why he had his reservations about making this a part of the actual narrative, because he's like, do I really want to go quite that far in being that explicit? Because it kind of ruins I guess it kind of ruins the otherness of the story a little bit, because now it's like you're basically just writing a prehistory for the Old Testament almost. But it's a really interesting read. And then there's not just this, but there's also an extra set of documents that I'm not going to get into here, but there's an extra set of documents where Tolkien goes into more detail about some of these ideas, and it just, the amount of thinking he did in regard to piecing all these ideas together in ways that they could be involved in Middle-earth is just really interesting to watch. So if you do want to read the whole thing and see it for yourself, because it's a lot better if you can just read it for yourself and digest it, because there's a lot there going on. But if you want to do that, do pick up Volume 10, the Morgoth's Ring volume of the History of Middle-earth series. It's really worth a read. So, hope you enjoyed that video. Hope you found that interesting, if not educational. It's really hard to say where that fits in, because it's a weird outlier in Tolkien's stuff. He never does this sort of thing, and yet here he did it. It just never made it into the published stuff. But if you did like it, please do give the video a thumbs up and share it around. If you want to follow me on Twitter at JRR Lore, you can catch some occasional Tolkien trivia questions. You can subscribe to the channel here. Don't forget to click that bell icon. You can support the channel here, and you can find 2 of my previous videos here. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.